The Life Outdoors radio show with Nate Bailey. Everything you need to know about hunting Southern Oregon. Wake the wild within.
Welcome to the Life Outdoors radio show. We thank you for listening, and we hope that you are enjoying what you're hearing. And if you are, please leave some feedback to this station, or go over to thelifeoutdoors.org, and that's the Life Outdoors, one word with a Z on the end of the outdoors, .org, and leave us a note over there. We have a forum. You could sign up to be a member on the website itself, and then you'll get all of our notifications of the stuff that's coming up, all the adventure hunts, all of the blog posts and new products that we're putting out as well. Again, we are a nonprofit. We're trying to get people in the outdoors, and we use all the profits from any of the merch that we sell goes into that cause. So if you guys want to become part of helping people hear what we believe God has put on outdoorsmen and what we believe that God is doing in the outdoor world, go over and sign up to be a member and check out what's going on at thelifeoutdoors.org. One of the things that we do believe, and you know, me being a veteran from two different services, I was in the Coast Guard and the Air Force, and being in the Coast Guard, I learned a lot about young men, manhood, adventure. That's kind of one of the big reasons I joined the Coast Guard, was to get up to Alaska so I could hunt and fish up there. But being able to get out and get in situations that are a little bit out of my hands. So, and I've liked to do that with most of my life. As I for some reason, I read a book. It was called In the Shadow of the Almighty when I was a teenager. And, you know, my walk with the Lord as a teenager wasn't the best in the world, but this book resonated with me because it was talking about a man named Jim Elliott. And he was full of adventure, and he was close to my family. My family, you know, one side of my family started in Portland, and he was part of that group up there, and he, you know, went through a lot of the same places that my family did around that area. So I could relate to him really well. If you guys don't know who Jim Elliott is, he was a missionary that went down to South America and was killed trying to reach the people of a tribe in South America there. And later on, his wife, Elizabeth Elliott, went in and reached those same people. The same people that actually speared him became the leaders of the church of that tribe. So it's an interesting and a very God-filled story. And but it's all, one of the big things about it was through this book, In the Shadow of the Almighty, a lot of his missionary days, he kept memoirs and he kept a diary. And so you can go through and read all of that. And it caught me because he loved adventure. He was full of adventure. And that's one of the things that I just, when I see that, it just grabbed my soul. And it put me on a course of where my life is now. My life has been lived for adventure. Sometimes not for the right type of adventure. Sometimes I just made up my own adventure and I tried to live just to be adventurous. But adventure actually calls you to something greater, something bigger. And Jim would definitely agree with that. Matter of fact, as he said, he is no fool who gives what he cannot gain and to keep what he cannot lose. So he understood that his life was here for a purpose and meaning, and there was only one meaning and purpose that it was here for. And I think we've lost that in our culture. I think that we don't understand that. You know, in the Coast Guard, we were in the 90s. It was a whole different atmosphere in the service than it has been. And, you know, I just got out in 2023, and it was a whole different feeling. In the 90s, everybody was giving of themselves. It seemed like in the later sessions, not that people weren't giving of themselves in the later times, but there was a lot more of what's the service going to do for me as well. One of the things that I did like about the service, and one of the things I think that go and sides with being in the service and doing, the stuff outdoors, is it puts you in circumstances where you have to rely on something bigger than yourself. Elk hunting and say even war have those things in common. And I think that's why we started Life Outdoors, because I know the value of being where you can't do anything of yourself. And I understand that. I understand the value of that, because now you have to look on something bigger and outside of yourself to sustain yourself and save yourself. And I see that every time that I kill an elk and I spill its blood. I understand that if we didn't eat, if we didn't kill to eat, and you kill everything that you eat, if we didn't kill to eat, we would die. And so there was a sacrifice made on our stead. And it points straight to who Jesus is. And that's because that's reality, and he's the creator of reality. So that's why we get in these circumstances. That's why we believe that the Life Outdoors is standing in that area. Now, the story that I'm going to tell you today, I would never want to happen in the Life Outdoors. But it's also something that has woke the wild within me, that showed me that there is something much greater than myself. It all started on a spring goose hunt. A buddy of mine and I decided that we were going to go spring goose hunting, and we had this great idea. We were going to go over to the Wood River wetlands, which is it's over in Klamath, and it's a BLM piece of wetlands, and it's surrounded by a dike. And they flooded these old pastures, and it just pulls birds in there left and right. But the problem is the fringes of it were all by a road, so it got hunted pretty heavy on the fringes. So if you could walk all the way around the perimeter of this thing. So the geese would go towards the middle. After the first couple of weeks of the season, the geese would just go right in towards the middle. And we came up with this idea. I had this little 12-foot John boat with a little mud motor on it. And we took our goose decoys and Gunner at the time, my dog Gunner, and our shotguns and some shells. And we went down through there, and the goose decoys were so many, we put them up front that you couldn't see over the bow. But we didn't pay much attention to that. So we took it down the slough, drug it over the bank, put it into this flooded pasture land. Now, this pasture land had these ditches that run parallel to each other throughout the whole 4,000 acres. And that's how it used to get irrigated. They would irrigate out these ditches. So our plan was we'd go in there and we would put the boat in, and then we'd run these ditches. And so we were running the ditches for sure, going through there. Everything was like really working out the way that we thought it was going to. I had a little 8 horsepower mud motor, and it didn't plane us, but we didn't plow too bad either. But we weren't paying attention to what was going on up front, because the decoys were in the way. We couldn't even see the bow. And so everything was going good. And then we turned into the wind, and we started heading perpendicular to it, and right in the middle of this thing. So we're probably 4 or 5 miles out there. And we're getting right in the middle, and we're going into the wind. And we didn't realize as we were going into the wind that water was coming over the bow. And with all the decoys up there, you didn't know. And with 2 full-sized adults, a dog, and all those decoys and our guns and our shells, we didn't have a whole lot of freeboard in the first place. Well, as we were going through, the boat decided that it was a submarine. And that's all I can describe it as, because that's exactly how it went. It was like down periscope. The bow fell underwater. The mud motor pushed it under, before I could get it shut down, it pushed it under another 10 feet. And all of a sudden we found ourselves going over. Gunner thought it was great. He thought we were all just going swimming. Now, the cool thing about it was these ditches were only probably 35 feet wide. So, but they were deep. They were super deep, probably 10 foot deep. And so, my buddy who was up front, Tucker, was a Marine. And the first thing, when he went over to Afghanistan as a Marine, and so he's pretty, battle hardened, knows how to think in situations and things like that. And I was in the Coast Guard, and so, we're both, well, we need to swim. And being a Marine, you don't leave your rifle behind. So he grabbed both of the shotguns, and we're in waders, mind you. I shouldn't be telling this story, but we're in both the shotgun. He had both shotguns, and he's kicking, laying and doing a back kick, laying on his back kicking, and he's kicking hard enough with the shotguns in his hand without using, and he's keeping his head above water and kicking towards the shore. And I'm swimming over, and Gunner, my dog, thinks that Tucker's having a great time and goes by and tries stepping on him and everything else. We get to the shore, and all of our decoys are just floating out in the middle, and the boat is upside down. And those mud motors, I don't know if you know how they're attached, but they have a pin that comes up from the transom mount. And then that pin, it just slides down over that pin, and then you put a nut on it. But I never put the nut on because you got to pull the nut to take it back off. And when we transport it, we took the engine completely off. So the engine fell off the back of it. So the boat's floating upside down. And then another thing that was peculiar about that engine is the fact that it had a remote gas tank. So we had a regular boat motor gas tank on it, and probably about 6 foot of hose. So we get to the edge, and we're mind you, we're probably about the only people out there in the wetland, and we're so far away from the dock, or even, I mean, we could walk out, but it's going through Tules and the marsh. And could you imagine walking that back? And we didn't know what to do. These are the only situations you get into when you go and you start doing things outdoors. I was out in the marsh yesterday, duck hunting, and I watched some young guys get out of their boat, and they decided they're going to go jump shoot the marsh. And they got themselves stuck in a spot over there. We could hear them way across the marsh, and it was starting to get dark on them, and they were having to push. And I could just remember those days, that these are the things that push you and make you something, make you have to look to something greater than yourself. A lot of times we get ourselves in these stupid situations, but then we start praying to get back out of them. And that's exactly what Tucker and I were doing. We're like, what are we going to do here? And we didn't have any ideas really. But the one thing that we did know is that the boat's upside down, and we could see the gas tank floating. So we know that fuel line's still attached to that motor down there somewhere. The motor itself, I shut it off before we went completely over, which I don't know why. I just did. And so we know that that's all the way it was, but it was still out there quite a ways, and the way that duck gear is, if you got good duck gear, your seams are pretty well tight, and even your waders are tight. We had neoprene waders. So we didn't get a ton of water down our stuff. Of course, we got wet on the ends, but we honestly didn't have a ton of water get into our gear. A lot less than I thought we would. And so we're sitting there and kind of taking into account what we have. And I had a Leatherman in my pocket, which was cool. I was like, well, that's something. And all of our shotguns were there. I still had shells in my jacket. And I started pulling off layers and started checking. And sure enough, there wasn't, we were pretty dry in spots. Now, like our arms were pretty wet. What was underneath the waders, like up around our neck, was pretty wet, but it wasn't that bad. And so we started thinking, well, I started stripping down, and it wasn't this was spring goose hunting. So it wasn't like we were in December and the wind was blowing and the snow was blowing sideways. So this is one of those places that you're in that you feel like, well, we could deal with this. So we took a step back and started praying and thinking, man, we need to think straight here. Lord, give us some wisdom, smart thinking. That's all what we need now, because we didn't use any to get here, and we need smart thinking to get out of here. And so that's what we did. I'll tell you how it comes about after the break, you guys. Don't turn off of this, because you want to hear what happens next. It's super crazy. And it's just one of those things that you could only experience if you're out doing this stuff. And this is just one of many things that we experience. And this is kind of like advanced level stuff. Not a lot of people are going to try this until they've tried other things. So this is something that was built up to. So what we're trying to do here at the Life Outdoors is to get you guys to start thinking about the adventure of your life and get away from a lot of this modern stuff, because you won't know something. You're missing something of Jesus through this. There's a lot of adventure out there, and it's not just in hunting and fishing, but you guys could relate to me because I could relate to it through hunting and fishing. So come back and I'll tell you after the break here. I'll tell you how this story finishes.
Hunting Southern Oregon. The Life Outdoors radio show on Gold Country Radio with Nate Bailey. Keep it tuned right here for more ways to perfect your craft. Coming up next, Wake the Wild Within.
Want to get your business noticed? Sponsor a show on KKFO Gold Country Radio on 103.3 FM and create awareness through on-air announcements, our online stream at goldcountryradio.org, and our podcasts that live on forever. Your message reaches a broad local audience while also targeting listeners who choose to tune in to the shows they love. Plus, we promote your sponsorship across our website and social media. For more information, email goldcountryradio@gmail.com. Call 541-238-6989 or visit goldcountryradio.org. Gold Country Radio, your message heard locally and beyond.
The Life Outdoors radio show with Nate Bailey. Everything you need to know about hunting Southern Oregon. Wake the Wild Within.
Welcome back from the break, you guys. So there we were out here, 5 miles out in the middle of nowhere, and we'd just taken stock of what went on. I started pulling my clothes off, started pulling the layers off, kind of letting the wind. It was a little bit windy that day, so we're kind of letting the wind dry things out. And it's kind of funny when you step back and you're forced into things. You're going to start looking at things differently. And if you can grab a hold of your emotion and just start thinking objectively, things will come to you. And I experienced a lot of this in the Coast Guard. We had to think objectively through chaos, and Tucker thought, through chaos of war, having to think objectively through these things. And so at this moment, we're sitting there thinking, man, what are we going to do? And then it dawned on us, well, if that fuel tank's floating, that motor is still there. And so I stripped down to nothing, absolutely nothing, because I wanted to keep everything as dry as I could. All my underclothes were still dry except for at the arms and around the neck. And I wanted to keep everything as dry as I could. So as we were talking about this, I stripped down to everything. I walk out as far as I could and grabbed a goose decoy underneath both arms. So I had 2 goose decoys, as naked as I was the day I was born. And I'm paddling out there and I grab a hold of the fuel tank and I start pulling it back. I let go of one of the goose decoys, put the fuel tank under my other arm and hold on to the other goose decoy. And I'm paddling back. And as I'm paddling back, I could feel just a little resistance, but I knew that the motor wasn't completely dragging on the bottom. So we're paddling back and we could grab the fuel line and we're pulling ever so slowly. And all of a sudden we can start seeing the top of the handle. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those mud motors, but the one that we have, the handle is probably 3 foot long, and then behind it's another 6 or 7 foot long, and then the motor sits in the middle. And we can start seeing the handle, and I lunge out there, grab the handle. About that same time, the fuel line popped off of, because you can only pull on those things so much. They're just a little metal tab. And it popped off, and we pulled the engine in. Yeah, it was a little bit nutty. And before we even started it, I had those multi-tool in my coat. So I got the multi-tool out and we pulled the spark plug off. We were able to twist it out with the multi-tool and we turned the engine over and got all the water out of it. Checked the oil. Of course, it was way over full and looked like, coffee because it emulsified, the oil emulsified with water. So we drained it down to just a little bit over full because we wanted to keep all that lubrication properties as much as we could. right? But if you have too much oil in there, then it'll beat it and it'll put air in it, and then you lose some of the lubrication then too. So we knew that. So we drained all the oil out, or not all of it, just enough to, and then put the spark plug back in, hooked the fuel line back to it, looked down in the fuel tank, and there was no water in the fuel tank, and started the engine, and it started up. And we're like, oh, we're in business. We're going to make it through this. And then I swam out again, just as naked as the day I was born, swam out again, grabbed the boat, and we hauled it back in, and then got it close enough, and we could flip it over. And we flipped it over, and it still had a little bit of water in it, but we were able to pull it up on the bank and then flip it again. And so we started thinking, we got all of the decoys back. We got the motor back. Of course, it was a little bit sketchy. And we have the gas tank back, and we have our shotguns, and we still had some shells, and even had my thermos full of coffee because it was floating as well. So we got it too. So we put it all back together, put our clothes back on, and we're semi-dry. I mean, we were pretty stinking dry. We probably get that wet when we're hunting, just by putting decoys in the water and pulling them out and dropping stuff in the water and reaching down and grabbing it. So we're pretty used to how wet we were. So we decided, well, let's make our way back to the boat ramp. Now, imagine this, you guys. Imagine this. I don't know if you guys spend much time out in the marsh, but could you imagine what it would be like to be stuck 5 miles out in the middle of a marsh somewhere? We didn't even, back in those days, all I had was a BlueBerry phone. It wasn't even, remember those old Blueberries? And so thank goodness, because if I had a phone now, we probably would have had naked pictures of me on Instagram by now, but, which would have been horrible, right? Thank goodness some of the cell phone stuff wasn't around when I was younger, because some of the stuff that we had to pull is stuff that you probably don't want running around the internet. But anyhow, we didn't even have the number to the sheriff. Like nowadays, I have the number to the sheriff in my boat and in my phone. And if something happened, say just, my battery died or something like that, I could call up and he'd be out there in no time. I'd have a GPS, I could send him a pin, but that's not how it was back then. That's not how any of that was. You were pretty much on your own. And just think about that. Here we are out in the middle of this barren marsh that we would have to figure out a way to walk out of. And it would have taken us all day to get out of there. And then we would have lost almost everything that we had. I mean, we would have had to get back out there somehow to go get the boat and the motor and stuff. But divine intervention, I believe, for that motor to be able to, where we could get it in and the hose didn't pop off until we got it to the bank. If that hose popped off and we weren't able to get that thing any closer, it would have just sunk down the bottom. There's no way I could have dove down and got it. For one, I wouldn't have been able to see it. I would have had to dive down and feel for it. But it all worked out. And I took it for granted back then. That could have been nasty. That could have turned into something that was completely horrible. But this is the mindset that we had. And we didn't even go all the way back to the dock. We found a place that the geese were using, so we stopped there and hunted for the rest of the day until we got to the dock. Of course, we were being a lot more careful, but at the same time, we were like, well, we're already out here. We got a thermos full of hot coffee to keep us warm. We might as well hunt, and we ended up shooting geese that day. That is, when I look back on it and I look through time, and I start looking at some of the things that have changed within the way that even... And this is a story about guys that had a lot of technology and a lot of stuff. Compare that to like 100 years before and some of the stories that, say, my grandfather came through. The reason I bring this up and the reason I talk about it is because I think there's a certain thing that we lose in this world. I think there's some things that we lose through making things easier for us. And now, don't get me wrong. Technology and the advancement of medicine and a lot of these things, a lot of people wouldn't be alive now if it wasn't for that. But understand too that it was this adventurous spirit that led to those technological advances. I mean, for people to get into a spaceship and get blown into the atmosphere, past the atmosphere, that took an amazing amount of I don't know what you would call it, kahunas, testosterone. I don't know. I don't want to just, because there's, women that have done amazing things too. And I don't want to just leave it at testosterone, but this spirit of a little bit of wildness, right? But I think we, as a society, have lost that. Man, I look at some of these old commercials and I see guys on their big wheels, and they showed, like in the 70s, where they had this big wheel where you could pull a brake on it and it would make you do circles. And all these kids were riding down through there, and none of them had any helmets on. And I realize more kids died probably from head injuries back in those days than they do now. But there's certain towns, like here in Southern Oregon, that you can't. I remember we helped with Youth for Christ, and we had a skate park in, and kids would show up without helmets, and the cops would come by and tell them that they could write them a ticket for not having a helmet on. That's absolutely ludicrous to me. That now we've gone from pressing ourselves into this stuff, and now we're trying to protect so much that we have learned how to be apathetic. And I think our young men and our young women are growing up in an apathetic world where they don't believe that they could do a lot of the things. Another thing too is, there's a thing called dopamine that we're given, that when we accomplish hard things, when stuff happens and we get through it, and you get a shot of dopamine, and that makes you do harder things. That makes you continue to do these hard things. But I think we artificially get those shots too through the things that we do. Nowadays, technology puts us in the seat where we can actually get shots of dopamine from something that is not real anymore. And if you look at like the metaverse and everything, where everything's moving towards that end, now you're getting shots of dopamine for doing nothing, but in your brain you did a ton of things. I'm not down on video games by any means, but if you look at how worlds were built, say in Minecraft, young men, a lot of times, it was mostly young men, would get this shot of dopamine from the universe that they built within a computer that really doesn't exist in reality. And that's why we've created the Life Outdoors, is we want to bring people back to the reality of having to deal with cold, having to deal with a boat that you flip over. We of course, we don't want anybody to be in those circumstances, and we're never going to put people in those circumstances. But at the same time, just living in the woods for a week elk hunting puts people in circumstances that they've never been in before. When we did the Crucible Project, we had people that were there that were setting up their tents, and they were asking me, and these guys never, spent the night in a wilderness area like that. But they were asking me, should they put their tent next to the trees because the bears could come in there? And I was thinking to myself, man, I never even think about that kind of stuff anymore. I just put my tent wherever I want it because, if the birds come in, I'll just shoot them. But the thing about it is it's amazing to me that they were up against these realities that they never had to face. Even elk hunting in a wall tent in a big camp. It's now because we're out there, and there are bears probably right around camp, and they can come through camp, and if we don't keep our camp clean, if we don't, they'll probably get into our food at night. And so these are the realities that I think we've lost in society that we need to get back. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want to throw technology away. I think technology is a great thing. I think that there's a lot of pioneers and a lot of adventurous attitudes that have built technology. But at the same time, when we're using this stuff to keep us out of having to rely on God and having to rely on just getting through things, and I think we take some of the human spirit, the God-given human spirit, away. And we don't rely on him anymore. And that's why I say when we talk about waking the wild within, that's what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to get people to understand that they have to have the Spirit of God working through them to be able to face a lot of these things. Now, I realize, you guys, that there's atheists that have gone through hard things and they find it in themselves and stuff, but they got to realize that is just they were made in God's image, and that's just leftovers from being made in God's image. Even if they don't want to give him the credit for that, there are not dogs sailing around the earth, getting stuck in the ice, and then having to mull their way through it, and then having to come up against the moral decisions that they have to. That's all God-given stuff. That's all humanity that God created. And so that's why here at the Life Outdoors, we're creating this space where people have to think about God and they have to think about outside. And adventure does that. And even having to hike up huge mountains, feeling the hurt, and then understanding. I bet you some people that come on our trips have probably never slept as well as they slept on our trips in their life. And it's a combination of achieving something. It's a combination of having, physically draining yourself, spiritually and mentally draining yourself, and all these things. So that when we talk about, and when we have the key phrase of wake the wild within, that's what we're talking about, is we want people to realize that they are not themselves. They are not the king of their world, that there is something spiritual going on for them being out there. And that spirit needs to wake up. So that's what we're talking about here. You guys, until next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. But until next week, you guys, find a way to get out there and wake that wild within. Even if it's going up in the snow and going cross-country skiing and having a time crunch of getting out of the woods before it's dark, you're going to have to live outside yourself. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about wake the wild within. So get out there. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. And get out there and wake that wild within.
Thanks for listening to the Life Outdoors radio show. Tune in next Sunday evening at 7 p.m. to continue to hone the primitive skills that man has always been meant to master. Hunting, Southern Oregon. The Life Outdoors radio show with Nate Bailey. Wake the wild within.